In the winter of 1812, in the remote village of Steinbach, nestled deep within the Bavarian forest near the border with Austria, a discovery would emerge that would forever change how the world understood certain folk tales. The village, home to no more than 300 souls, lay 17 kilometers southeast of the larger town of Passau, connected only by a narrow dirt road that became impassable during heavy rains. It was here, in a timber-framed house on the village's eastern edge, that the Grimm brothers would encounter a story that would test the very limits of what they could publish in their collection of German folk tales. The house belonged to the Brenner family, whose lineage in Steinbach stretched back over 2 centuries. Johann Friedrich Brenner, a widowed carpenter of 43 years, lived there with his 3 daughters, Margarete, aged 22, Katharina, 20, and Elizabeth, 18. The family had fallen into reduced circumstances following the death of Johann's wife, Anna, 3 years prior during a particularly harsh winter. What the villagers did not know, and what would only come to light through a series of disturbing discoveries decades later, was that the Brenner household harbored secrets that would make the darkest fairy tales seem mild by comparison. The brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm arrived in Steinbach on the 15th of November, 1812, as part of their systematic collection of German folk narratives. They had been directed to the village by a contact in Munich who claimed that the region preserved some of the oldest and most authentic versions of traditional stories. Their host was Pastor Heinrich Müller, a thin man in his 50s who had served the village church for nearly 2 decades. It was Pastor Müller who first mentioned that the Brenner family might have stories worth collecting, though he did so with a notable hesitancy that the brothers initially attributed to the natural reserve of rural people toward outsiders. The Brenner house sat at the end of a lane bordered by ancient oak trees, their bare branches creating a canopy that blocked most of the weak November sunlight. The structure itself was typical of the region. Heavy timber frame filled with wattle and daub, a steep-pitched roof designed to shed snow, and small windows fitted with thick glass that distorted the view from within. What struck the Grimm brothers immediately upon their first visit was the profound silence that seemed to emanate from the building itself. Even their knocking on the heavy wooden door seemed muted, as though the house absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. Johann Brenner, who answered the door, was a man whose appearance suggested he carried burdens beyond those visible to casual observation. His hands, though strong from years of carpentry work, trembled slightly when he gestured, and his eyes rarely met those of his visitors directly. When the brothers explained their purpose, Johann's reaction was curious. He seemed neither surprised nor pleased, but rather resigned, as though he had been expecting this visit for some time. He invited them in with a gesture that seemed more like surrender than hospitality. The interior of the house was meticulously clean but oddly sparse. The main room contained only the most essential furniture, a wooden table scarred by years of use, several simple chairs, and a large hearth that dominated one wall. What was most notable was what was absent. There were no decorative objects, no family portraits, no personal belongings visible anywhere in the space. The walls, whitewashed and unmarked, seemed to press inward, creating an atmosphere of careful containment rather than comfortable dwelling. Margaret, the eldest daughter, appeared first when her father called for the girls. She was a woman of unusual composure, moving with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to being observed and judged. Her dress was plain but well-maintained, and her dark hair was pulled back severely from a face that might have been considered beautiful if not for an expression of perpetual wariness. When she spoke, her voice was measured and careful, each word seeming to be considered before it was allowed to escape. Katharina emerged next, and the contrast with her older sister was immediately apparent. Where Margaret was controlled, Katerina seemed barely contained. Her movements were quick and nervous, her hands constantly busy with some small task, smoothing her skirt, adjusting her collar, picking at the edges of her sleeves. When she looked at her father, there was something in her expression that the Grimm brothers would later struggle to define. Not fear exactly, but a kind of anticipatory tension that suggested she was always braced for some unpleasant surprise. Elizabeth, the youngest, was the last to appear, and her entrance was the most unsettling of all. She moved with the cautious steps of someone navigating in partial darkness, though the room was adequately lit by candles and the fire. Her eyes, while focused and alert, had a quality that suggested she was seeing things that others could not. When Jacob Grimm later wrote about this first meeting, he noted that Elizabeth seemed to be listening to sounds that no one else could hear, occasionally tilting her head as though trying to catch whispered words from some distant conversation. The family's initial reluctance to share stories was apparent, but Johann eventually agreed to allow his daughters to speak with the brothers. What emerged over the course of several visits was a version of what would later become known as Cinderella, but told in terms that made both collectors deeply uncomfortable. The story, as related primarily by Elizabeth, with occasional corrections from her sisters, centered not on magic and transformation, but on a household where survival required a level of submission and silence that bordered on the unnatural. According to Elizabeth's account, there had once been a fourth member of their household, Anna Marie, a young woman of uncertain origin who had come to live with the family several years prior. The circumstances of her arrival were never clearly explained, but it was suggested that she had been orphaned and taken in by Johann out of Christian charity. Anna Marie, according to the story, had been given the task of maintaining the household while the three daughters pursued more refined activities. What made Elizabeth's telling particularly disturbing was not what she said, but how she said it. Her description of Anna Marie's daily routine was delivered in a monotone that suggested she was reciting something she had memorized rather than remembered. The young woman, she explained, rose before dawn to tend the fire, prepare meals, and clean the house. She ate after the family had finished, slept in a small space near the kitchen hearth, and was expected to remain silent unless directly addressed. The story took a darker turn when Elizabeth described the arrival of visitors to the Brenner house. According to her account, wealthy merchants and minor nobility from neighboring towns would occasionally come to call, ostensibly to conduct business with Johann, but seemingly more interested in observing his daughters. During these visits, Anna Marie was required to serve food and drink while remaining invisible to the guests, a feat she accomplished by moving with such practiced silence that she seemed to vanish even while performing her duties. Jacob Grimm noted in his journal that during Elizabeth's narration, both Margaret and Katerina would exchange glances that seemed to communicate something beyond the reach of words. When he attempted to question them directly about Anna Marie, their responses were evasive and contradictory. Margaret claimed not to remember much about the girl, while Katerina would become agitated and change the subject entirely. The climax of Elizabeth's story involved what she described as a great celebration held in the house, during which Anna Marie had been dressed in fine clothes borrowed from the sisters and presented to the assembled guests. The description of this event was where Elizabeth's previously steady narration began to break down. Her voice would catch on certain words, and she would pause for long moments, as though trying to remember details that seemed to slip away even as she reached for them. According to Elizabeth, the celebration had lasted for 3 consecutive nights, with the same ritual repeated each evening. Anna Marie would be dressed, presented, and then would disappear before dawn, returning to her usual duties as though nothing had happened. When Wilhelm Grimm attempted to clarify the nature of these observations, Elizabeth's response was a long silence, followed by the simple statement that Anna-Marie had been chosen for something special. When pressed for details about what this selection entailed, Elizabeth would only say that Anna-Marie had been very happy to be chosen and had gone to live in a beautiful place where she would never have to work again. The final element of Elizabeth's story was perhaps the most troubling. The guests, Elizabeth claimed, were particularly interested in observing Anna-Marie's behavior during these presentations, watching her with an intensity that made the story deeply uncomfortable to hear. She claimed that Anna-Marie had left behind her old clothes and a few personal belongings, which the family had kept as remembrances. When Jacob asked to see these items, Johann's reaction was immediate and forceful. He stated that the belongings had been disposed of according to Anna-Marie's own wishes, and that it would be inappropriate to dwell on material objects when discussing someone who had found such happiness. The brothers' attempts to gather more information about Anna-Marie from other village sources proved frustrating and ultimately fruitless. Pastor Müller, when questioned, claimed to have no knowledge of any fourth member of the Brenner household. The village's few other residents either professed complete ignorance of the matter or would quickly change the subject when Anna-Marie's name was mentioned. This pattern of selective memory was so consistent that it seemed almost rehearsed. What particularly disturbed the Grimm brothers was the physical evidence that contradicted the villagers' claims of ignorance. In the village cemetery, they discovered a small, unmarked grave in a corner section typically reserved for strangers and the indigent. The grave appeared to have been recently tended, with fresh flowers that someone had placed there despite the late season. When they asked the gravedigger about the unmarked burial, he claimed to have no memory of digging it, though he admitted the earth in that section had been disturbed sometime in the previous 2 years. The brothers also noted architectural anomalies in the Brenner house that suggested recent modifications. A doorway in the kitchen had been bricked over, and the plaster covering the bricks was noticeably newer than that on the surrounding walls. In the basement, they observed that one section of the stone foundation had been rebuilt, with different colored mortar indicating that the work had been done relatively recently. When Johann was asked about these alterations, he explained them as routine maintenance necessitated by the harsh winters, but his explanation was delivered with the same careful precision that characterized all his responses to uncomfortable questions. During their final visit to the Brenner house, the brothers experienced something that would trouble them for years afterward. While Elizabeth was concluding her version of the story, they heard what sounded like footsteps in the upper level of the house, despite the fact that all 4 family members were present in the main room. When Jacob mentioned the sound, the entire family froze for a moment, before Johann explained that old houses often creaked and settled, particularly during cold weather. The explanation was reasonable, but the family's reaction suggested something more significant than routine house sounds. The brothers left Steinbach with the feeling that they had gathered a story, but not the complete story. Elizabeth's narrative contained all the elements of a traditional folk tale: a mistreated young woman, cruel family members, a magical transformation, and a happy ending. However, the details that surrounded the telling suggested a reality far removed from fairy tale conventions. The careful coaching evident in Elizabeth's responses, the family's collective nervousness, and the village's determined amnesia all pointed toward events that had been deliberately obscured rather than naturally forgotten. Wilhelm Grimm's private correspondence from this period reveals his growing conviction that the Brenner family story was not a traditional folk narrative at all, but rather a careful revision of actual events designed to create an acceptable version of something that had been decidedly unacceptable. His letters to Jacob suggest that he believed Anna-Marie had been a real person whose fate had been deliberately concealed by the family and the village community. The brothers ultimately decided not to include Elizabeth's version of the story in their collection, choosing instead to work with other variants they had collected from different sources. Their published version of Cinderella sanitized the elements that had made the Brenner family's account so disturbing, transforming it into a tale suitable for children, rather than a narrative that raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, submission, and silence in rural German society. However, the Brenner story continued to haunt both brothers. Jacob's journals contain numerous references to dreams featuring a young woman who moved through a house without making any sound, always just out of sight of the dreamer. Wilhelm developed a persistent anxiety about visiting isolated rural communities, claiming that he could no longer trust the stories he was told because he had become too aware of the stories that were being withheld. The truth about what had happened to Anna Marie might have remained buried forever, if not for a discovery made 47 years later, in 1859, during renovations to the old Brenner house. Johann had died in 1841, followed by Margarete in 1845 and Katharina in 1852. Elizabeth, the last survivor, had become increasingly reclusive in her final years, rarely leaving the house and speaking to no one except when absolutely necessary. When Elizabeth died in 1858, the house passed to a distant cousin who decided to modernize the structure for rental purposes. During the renovation work, laborers discovered a hidden space beneath the kitchen floor, accessible only through a concealed trapdoor that had been covered by the stove. The space was small, perhaps 3 feet by 6 feet, and barely tall enough for a person to sit upright, but it showed clear signs of extended habitation. Inside the hidden chamber, workers found items that painted a picture of prolonged confinement. A straw mattress that had been used until it was compressed to almost nothing, a wooden bowl worn smooth by countless meals, and scraps of fabric that appeared to have been used for clothing repair. Most disturbing was a collection of marks scratched into the wooden walls, apparently made with fingernails over an extended period. The marks formed no recognizable pattern, but their quantity suggested that whoever had made them had spent considerable time in the space with nothing else to occupy their attention. The workers also discovered something that definitively linked the chamber to the story the Grimm brothers had heard decades earlier. A small leather pouch containing strands of dark hair, fingernail clippings, and what appeared to be teeth that had been carefully preserved. Attached to the pouch was a piece of parchment with writing in an untrained hand that read, "Anna Marie Hoffmann. Born 1800, died here 1813. May God forgive them all." The discovery was reported to the local authorities, but the case was quickly closed due to the advanced age of the potential crime and the deaths of all the principals involved. The official report stated that while the evidence suggested someone had been confined in the space, there was no way to determine whether this confinement had been voluntary or involuntary, and no living witnesses could provide testimony about the circumstances. However, the renovation also uncovered additional evidence that was not included in the official report. These papers, which were quickly confiscated by church authorities and declared to be potentially scandalous, reportedly contained correspondence between Johann Brenner and several men from neighboring towns regarding what was described as the arrangement. According to a worker who had briefly examined the documents before their confiscation, the letters discussed payments made to Johann in exchange for access to the household and made specific references to Anna Marie's training for service. The correspondence apparently spanned several years and included detailed instructions about maintaining secrecy and ensuring that no official notice would be taken of the arrangements. One letter, according to the worker's account, explicitly stated that Anna Marie had exceeded all expectations in her willingness to accept instruction, and that the isolation had produced exactly the desired level of compliance. Another document apparently contained a list of rules governing Anna-Marie's behavior, including specific punishments for speaking without permission, making eye contact with visitors, or showing any sign of distress during what were termed presentation periods. The most damaging document, according to this second-hand account, was a letter from a physician in Passau acknowledging that he had examined Anna-Marie at Johann's request and had certified that she was suitable for the intended purposes, despite her youth and inexperience. D. The letter apparently went on to note that Anna-Marie's naturally submissive temperament made her ideal for training, and that proper conditioning would ensure complete cooperation. The Church's decision to suppress these documents was motivated, according to later accounts, by a desire to protect not just the deceased Brenner family's reputation, but also the reputations of several prominent men from the region who were allegedly mentioned in the correspondence. Hidden behind loose stones in the basement wall, workers found a collection of letters and documents that revealed a very different version of the events the Grimm brothers had investigated. The official explanation was that the documents were too fragmentary and unreliable to support any conclusions about historical events, and that their contents might cause unnecessary distress to innocent parties. However, the suppression of the documents did not prevent rumors from circulating throughout the region. By 1860, stories were being told in taverns and marketplaces about a network of wealthy men who had used isolated farmhouses as locations for activities that could not be conducted in more public venues. These rumors suggested that young women from impoverished families were sometimes offered as payment for debts or as security for loans, with the understanding that they would be trained for household service in ways that were never clearly defined. The Anna-Marie story took on additional dimensions when researchers in the early 20th century began investigating the historical accuracy of folk tales collected by the Grimm brothers. A scholar named Dr. Friedrich Kastner, working at the University of Munich in 1907, became interested in tracing the actual sources of the brothers' stories and began visiting the villages where they had conducted their research. When Dr. Kastner reached Steinbach, he found that the Anna-Marie story had not been forgotten, despite the Church's efforts to suppress it. Elderly villagers, speaking carefully and only after being assured of anonymity, revealed that the story had been passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting outsiders and the importance of protecting young women from men with unnatural appetites. According to these oral accounts, Anna-Marie had not been an orphan taken in by the Brenner family out of charity, but rather the daughter of a family in desperate financial circumstances who had been offered a solution to their debts in exchange for their daughter's service. The arrangement had been presented as a form of domestic employment that would provide Anna-Marie with valuable training while helping to support her family through difficult times. The villagers' version of events suggested that Anna-Marie had initially believed she was being taken into a household where she would learn cooking, cleaning, and other domestic skills that would prepare her for eventual marriage and independence. However, the training she received was of a very different nature, designed to create what the correspondents had termed perfect compliance rather than practical skills. The oral history also included details about the presentation nights that Elizabeth Brenner had described to the Grimm brothers. According to the villagers, these events were not celebrations in any conventional sense, but rather opportunities for Johann's associates to observe and evaluate Anna-Marie's progress in her training. The fine clothes she was dressed in were costume rather than gift, designed to present her in ways that would appeal to the observer's particular preferences. What made these accounts particularly disturbing was their matter-of-fact tone. The villagers who shared them seemed to regard Anna-Marie's fate as tragic, but not particularly surprising. suggesting that similar arrangements were not unknown in rural areas where poverty made families vulnerable to exploitation by wealthy men seeking opportunities that respectable society would not provide. Dr. Kastner's investigation also uncovered evidence that the Anna Marie case was not isolated. Church records from the period showed patterns of young women disappearing from their families' homes under circumstances that were officially recorded as domestic service placement, but that left no trace of actual employment. These disappearances were concentrated in areas where poor families lived within traveling distance of towns that supported populations of wealthy merchants and landowners. In 1912, exactly 100 years after the Grimm brothers' visit to Steinbach, Dr. Kastner published a carefully worded paper that suggested that some German folk tales might have originated not as traditional narratives, but as coded accounts of actual events that were too disturbing to be discussed directly. His paper, titled Hidden Histories in Popular Narratives, argued that stories like Cinderella might preserve memories of social practices that official records had deliberately obscured. Dr. Kastner's work was not well received by the academic establishment of his time. Critics argued that his methodology was unsound and that his conclusions were based on speculation rather than verifiable evidence. The paper was quietly withdrawn from circulation, and Dr. Kastner himself was strongly encouraged to pursue other research topics. He spent his remaining career studying less controversial aspects of German literature, and never again published anything related to folktale origins. However, Dr. Kastner's research notes survived and were discovered in university archives in 1964. Among these notes was a detailed account of his interview with the last person to have direct knowledge of the Anna Marie case, Father Georg Huber, who had served as an assistant to Pastor Müller in 1812 and who was still alive, though extremely elderly, when Dr. Kastner conducted his research. According to Dr. Kastner's notes, Father Huber confirmed many of the details that had emerged from other sources. He acknowledged that Pastor Müller had been aware of the arrangement involving Anna Marie, but had felt powerless to intervene because of the wealth and influence of the men involved. Father Huber also confirmed that Anna Marie's death had been deliberately concealed and that she had been buried in the unmarked grave that the Grimm brothers had observed. Most significantly, Father Huber revealed that Pastor Müller had kept detailed records of his suspicions and observations, hidden in the church archives, because he believed that someday the truth would need to be told. These records, according to Father Huber, included copies of documents that Johann Brenner had shown to Pastor Müller when seeking religious justification for the arrangement, as well as Pastor Müller's own observations of Anna Marie's deteriorating condition over the months before her death. Father Huber's account suggested that Pastor Müller had attempted to intervene on several occasions, but had been threatened with exposure of certain indiscretions in his own past that would have resulted in his removal from office. The pastor had been forced to choose between protecting Anna Marie and protecting his ability to serve his congregation, a choice that had tormented him for the rest of his life. The records that Pastor Müller had hidden were apparently discovered and destroyed by church authorities sometime in the 1860s, as part of a broader effort to remove potentially scandalous materials from parish archives throughout Bavaria. Father Huber claimed to have witnessed the destruction of these documents and to have been sworn to secrecy about their contents, a vow he had kept until his conversation with Dr. Kastner, when advanced age and the approach of death had made him feel obligated to ensure that someone knew the truth. The final piece of the puzzle emerged in 1968. When a construction project in Passau uncovered the foundation of a house that had been destroyed by fire in 1815. Among the ruins, workers found a collection of metal objects that had survived the blaze, brass buttons, silver coins, and what appeared to be pieces of jewelry that had been melted and fused together by the intense heat. Also found were fragments of documents that had been partially protected by being sealed in a metal container. These fragments, when examined by experts, proved to contain lists of names and what appeared to be financial accounts. Several of the names matched those of men who had been mentioned in the rumors surrounding the Anna Marie case, and the financial entries suggested regular payments for unspecified services over periods of several years. One partially legible entry read, AM, full compliance achieved, premium rate justified, recommend for advanced instruction. Another fragment contained what appeared to be a schedule of visits, with specific dates and times coordinated among multiple parties. The most disturbing fragment was a portion of what seemed to be an instruction manual, containing detailed directions for maintaining cooperation through graduated isolation and controlled nutrition. The discovery in Passau prompted a limited official investigation, but the findings were classified and sealed because of the potential implications for families whose names appeared in the recovered documents. The official explanation was that the materials were too fragmentary and too old to support definitive conclusions, and that any attempt to draw connections to specific individuals would constitute irresponsible speculation based on insufficient evidence. However, the investigation did result in one concrete action: the creation of a confidential file that was deposited in the Bavarian State Archives with instructions that it should remain sealed for 100 years from the date of its creation. This file, which will not be accessible until 2068, reportedly contains all the evidence that was gathered during the investigation, as well as expert analysis of its implications for understanding social conditions in early 19th century rural Germany. The story of Anna Marie Hoffmann and her transformation into the Cinderella of folktale represents one of the most disturbing examples of how narratives can be used to obscure rather than preserve historical truth. The tale that Elizabeth Brenner told to the Grimm brothers was carefully constructed to present acceptable explanations for events that were fundamentally unacceptable, transforming a story of exploitation and murder into a fairy tale of magical transformation and redemption. What makes the case particularly troubling is not just the fate of Anna Marie herself, but the systematic way in which an entire community participated in creating and maintaining a false narrative designed to protect the perpetrators while ensuring that the victim remained forever silent. The transformation of Anna Marie's story into a children's tale represents the ultimate victory of those who exploited her, turning even her suffering into entertainment for the very society that had failed to protect her. The Grimm brothers, despite their discomfort with what they had heard in Steinbach, ultimately chose to prioritize the creation of acceptable literature over the preservation of disturbing truth. Their decision to sanitize Elizabeth's story and incorporate elements of it into their published collection meant that millions of children would grow up hearing a version of Anna Marie's fate that erased all trace of the real person and the real suffering that lay behind the fairy tale veneer. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that Anna Marie's case was not unique. The evidence suggests that she was one of many young women whose lives were sacrificed to serve the desires of wealthy men who used their power and influence to create systems of exploitation that operated with the knowledge and complicity of respectable society. The stories of these other victims remain buried, their suffering transformed into entertainment or erased entirely from historical memory. Today, when children hear the story of Cinderella, they are told about magic and transformation, about good triumphing over evil and virtue being rewarded. They are not told about Annemarie Hoffmann, who died in a hidden chamber beneath a kitchen floor in Steinbach, Bavaria in 1813. After months or perhaps years of treatment that reduced her to something less than human in the eyes of those who were supposed to protect her. The cheerful fairy tale continues to be told, the dark truth continues to be buried, and somewhere in the Bavarian State Archives, a sealed file waits for a future generation to decide whether the time has finally come to let Annemarie speak for herself. Until that day arrives, the story of Cinderella will remain what it has always been, a lie told to make the truth bearable, a fantasy created to hide a reality too terrible for polite society to acknowledge. The house in Steinbach still stands, though it has been renovated so extensively that little remains of its original character. The hidden chamber beneath the kitchen floor was filled with concrete during the 1859 renovations, and the basement was completely rebuilt. Nothing visible now suggests the horrors that once took place within those walls, just as nothing in the published version of Cinderella suggests the real fate of the young woman whose suffering inspired the tale. But sometimes, according to those who have lived in the house since, the silence becomes too complete, too absolute, as though something within the walls is still listening for sounds that will never come. And sometimes, in the deep of winter when the wind howls through the oak trees that still border the lane, residents report hearing what sounds like footsteps moving through rooms that are empty, or the soft sound of someone weeping in a voice that carries the weight of suffering beyond words. These may be nothing more than the natural sounds of an old building settling in the cold, or the product of imagination, influenced by knowledge of the house's history. But those who have heard them cannot help but wonder if Annemarie Hoffmann is still there, still waiting for someone to tell her story as it really happened, still hoping that someday the truth will matter more than the comfortable lie that transformed her into a fairy tale princess who lived happily ever after in a world that exists only in stories told to children who do not yet know how cruel the real world can be. The investigation into Annemarie's fate officially ended in 1968 with the sealing of the archives, but her story continued to echo through academic circles in whispered conversations and carefully worded research papers. Dr. Kastner's suppressed work had planted seeds of doubt about the true origins of beloved fairy tales, and a small community of scholars began quietly investigating other stories collected by the Grimm brothers. What they discovered was a pattern of sanitization that extended far beyond the Cinderella tale. Multiple stories in the Grimm collection showed evidence of having been carefully edited to remove elements that suggested real-world violence, exploitation, and social dysfunction. The brothers had not simply collected folk tales, they had actively participated in transforming disturbing historical accounts into acceptable children's entertainment. In 1969, the last of Dr. Kastner's research notes surfaced during the clearing of university storage rooms. Among these final documents was a letter he had written but never sent, addressed to the Grimm Society in Kassel. The letter detailed his belief that the brothers had knowingly participated in covering up crimes against vulnerable members of German society, and that their sanitized fairy tales represented a form of historical revisionism designed to protect the powerful at the expense of their victims. The letter also contained Dr. Kastner's final assessment of the Annemarie case, that her death had been the inevitable result of a system that treated poor young women as commodities to be traded among wealthy men, and that the transformation of her suffering into a children's story represented the ultimate triumph of those who had destroyed her. He concluded by expressing his hope that someday, when society had evolved enough to face uncomfortable truths about its past, Annemarie's real story would be told without the fairy tale disguise. That hope remains unfulfilled. The sealed archives in Munich continue to guard their secrets. The renovated house in Steinbach shows no trace of its dark history. And children around the world continue to hear about Cinderella's magical transformation without knowing about Anna-Marie Hoffmann's tragic reality. The fairy tale has become so deeply embedded in popular culture that any attempt to reveal its true origins is dismissed as academic speculation or sensationalism. Perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps some truths are too dark to share, some realities too brutal to acknowledge. But in choosing comfort over truth, in preferring fantasy to fact, we ensure that the systems that enabled Anna-Marie's destruction continue to operate in shadows, protected by our collective willingness to believe that such things belong only in the distant past or in the realm of imagination. The story ends where it began, in silence. Anna-Marie Hoffmann died without a voice, was buried without recognition, and continues to exist only as a sanitized fiction that erases everything she actually was. Her real story will remain buried until 2068, when the sealed archives may finally be opened, though there is no guarantee that anyone will choose to listen to what they reveal. Until then, the glass slipper remains a symbol of transformation and hope rather than what it truly represents, the perfect fit of a lie designed to cover an unspeakable truth.